Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure and indeed an honor to deliver a keynote lecture at this conference celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Werner Report. I'm grateful to the organizers for their kind invitation and for the opportunity to share my thoughts with such a distinguished audience. And I truly much regret not being able to attend in person because of the restrictions imposed by the pandemic. The title of my lecture today is The Werner Report and the Checkered History of European Monetary Union. Monetary Union remains to this day the most important and daring act of European integration. It has had a long and checkered history, with many ups and downs, and never short of big crises. The report, issued in October 1970, tomorrow is in fact the anniversary, a report written by a committee of high-level experts, chaired by Pierre Werner, the Prime Minister and Finance Minister of Luxembourg at the time, was a pioneering document. It was also a blueprint for action that left an indelible mark on further developments. The Werner Report thus became a key turning point in Europe's long journey towards monetary union. Please allow me a short personal note in the beginning. My own European journey began at about the same time and was very much influenced by the Werner Report. Having received my European initiation rights at the College of Europe in Bruges, I then went on to Oxford to write my doctoral thesis in the early 1970s. I decided to write about the politics and economics of European monetary integration. And I did so against the considered advice of most of my professors there, who surely did not share my approach of the European community as an economic and political entity in the making, nor did they encourage my ambition to cross academic disciplines in the study of European integration. British pragmatism, we all know, has never been comfortable with the European project. And now Brexit comes as the unhappy end of a long, troubled relationship that has been marked by Britain's transactional approach to regional integration. Let us only hope that both sides will finally succeed in shaping a new special relationship with the UK outside the EU, although the omens today are not so good. British pragmatism, Euroscepticism if you prefer, was not the only problem I had to face as a young student with strong ideas of my own. In Oxford back then, as in most other universities across Europe and beyond at the time, economists, political scientists and international relations experts were meant to mind their own business and not to cross academic boundaries. Nowadays, the walls separating academic disciplines are even higher than they were back then, and only few people still try to climb them. I submitted my doctoral thesis to the University of Oxford in 1975. It was pretty fast. In my thesis, I tried to explain the reasons economic and monetary union had been set up and later failed, by concentrating on the study of national interests and policies. I dared draw the conclusion back then that EMU, this is the shortcut I shall use from now on, was bound to resurface and become again a big issue on the European political agenda. I explained the reasons, political and economic. I thought it would be so, at a time when monetary union looked more dead than a dead duck, as the English saying goes. Luckily for me, a few people, including my examiners, thought there was something in this unorthodox thesis and decided to award me the degree. The thesis was further developed and published as a book in 1977. It was republished by Routledge in 2017, that is 40 years later, and I was truly flattered that some people thought it was still relevant. In the meantime, I continued to study and contribute in a modest way to European integration, always on the borderline between disciplines and between academia and policymaking. I may also add that I was one of the first beneficiaries of the Pierre Werner Chair created at the Schumann Center of the European University Institute in Florence. But enough about myself, please rest assured. What I propose to do today is first to examine the political and economic context within which the Werner Report was produced. I shall then discuss the main driving forces in what Fernand Braudel, the famous French historian, would have called la longue durée of European monetary integration, although perhaps not so long by Braudel's standards. I shall conclude by trying to draw some lessons from the experience of the last 50 years or so. A tall order, some may think, but still I shall give it a try. So let us start from the beginning. The Treaty of Rome, that had come into effect in 1958, contained precious little in terms of binding constraints in the field of macroeconomic policy. Creating the customs union and the common agricultural policy, among other things, was ambitious enough. There was clearly no intention to set up a regional currency bloc at a time when the Bretton Woods system provided the international framework and the US dollar the undisputed monetary standard. It was also the time when Keynesianism was at its peak. National governments were only too keen to retain the independence of monetary and fiscal policies in the pursuit of domestic economic objectives. Those objectives included, of course, high growth, full employment, and low inflation. I would also add fair income distribution and social peace in times when social democratic values seemed to prevail. In addition, a heavy armory of capital controls was at the disposal of national governments to safeguard the independence of their economic policies. What changed gradually during the 1960s was the growing instability of the international monetary system and the ensuing threat to fixed exchange rates. Hence, also, the perceived need to insulate Europe from the vagaries of the US dollar. The French felt more strongly about this than the rest of Europeans and were keen to denounce the asymmetrical nature of the post-war international monetary system. Giscard d'Estaing, later President of France, spoke then of the exorbitant privilege of the US currency. The French also went on to call for a common European stance. Their aim was to extend to the monetary field the positive experience with the common external tariff that had forged European unity in trade policy and thus helped to change decisively the balance of power in international trade negotiations. The French have usually been good at making sense of the bigger picture. European monetary integration as a defensive move against US policies was, however, not something that many European governments were ready to countenance back in the 1960s or even in the 1970s. Thus, the external dimension of a European monetary union in an international system dominated by the US dollar was bound to be a sensitive political issue. And this, to put it mildly. The French were isolated back then. They are less so today on this issue. They also had to deal with a big internal contradiction in their own policy. While being keen on a common European stance in monetary affairs, preferably with France playing the leading role as far as they were concerned, they were not at all ready to accept the loss of national sovereignty that the monetary union, European monetary union, would imply. This contradiction lasted for long. It seems that with President Macron, France is finally ready to cut this Gordian knot. But let us now talk about exchange rates. There was genuine concern among many Europeans at the time about the survival of fixed exchange rates that were deemed to be essential for the common market and the common agricultural policy. And some people went as far as to genuinely believe that common agricultural prices would force a de facto, if not de jure, monetary union in Europe. This was, honestly, neo-functionalist fantasy taken to its extremes. Remember that neo-functionalist theory and strategy relied on small steps in integration, with strong spillover effects, and with much emphasis on the role of experts. But there is a big problem here. Money is high politics par excellence. It cannot therefore serve as one more example of neo-functionalist integration. Throughout its long, checkered history, EMU has been perceived by many people not only as an economic end in itself, but also crucially as the economic means to achieve political ends. At the time of the Werner Report, some of the fathers of Europe, there were really no mothers at the time, began to think of European monetary union as la voie royale vers l'union politique. Alas, the French contradiction I already referred to applied to most other Europeans as well. The gap between ambition and concrete action remained wide. Last but not least, European monetary union was meant to strengthen the community ahead of a British accession that was already on the table, or perhaps make it more difficult from the point of view of those not so keen on Britain becoming a member. Enlargement and deepening of integration, of which EMU was to be an integral part, were closely linked together. At the Hague Summit of December 1969, the summit that gave the first green light to EMU. Surely nobody could predict back then that many years later, in a European Union with many more functions and many more members, EMU would become the catalyst for Britain feeling increasingly marginalized inside the European Union, thus paving the way for Brexit. History sometimes plays strange games. When the first discussions began on the construction of a European monetary union, there were different views about appropriate rules and institutions to ensure its smooth functioning at the final stage, and even stronger differences about how to get there. Two different approaches emerged in those early discussions, those adopted by the so-called economists and so-called monetarists, respectively. Economists wanted to make sure that policy harmonization should precede any attempt to fix exchange rates or even reduce their intra-EC margins of fluctuation, while monetarists stressed the importance of the exchange rate discipline and the need to strengthen the European monetary unity in international fora. And it was very much a heated debate. Did these different approaches that pitted Germany and the Netherlands on one side against France, Belgium and Luxembourg on the other, with Italy often in between, represent different ideas or different interests? Professor James and others will dwell on this question in subsequent sessions, more competently than myself. Suffice to state here the obvious, namely that ideas are usually difficult to disentangle from interests. There is, however, a different point I would like to make. What may now appear as an arcane debate between economists and monetarists, the latter to be distinguished from monetarists of the Chicago School, is in fact related to a key issue that is bound to arise in any system of fixed exchange rates. And this is about the burden of adjustment and how the burden of adjustment will be distributed between surplus and deficit countries. This is not at all an arcane issue. It was first raised by Keynes during the Bretton Woods negotiations in 1944, and it has been hanging over European monetary integration all along, although it does not always dare speak its name in polite official circles. Decision makers often prefer diplomatic language or technical terms in the case of economists, which both tend to obfuscate what is at stake. In today's parlance, it is about macroeconomic imbalances in the Eurozone. But what is really at stake is symmetry, or lack thereof, in binding constraints between surplus and deficit countries in a monetary union. How then did the Werner Committee handle those difficult challenges and different approaches to EMU? Pierre Werner and his committee members surely had a difficult balancing act to perform. A balancing act that required delicate political skills. Looking back, I think it is fair to conclude that they acquitted themselves with remarkable dexterity. I'm sure you will have the opportunity to discuss the Werner report in more detail in other sessions of this conference. I shall only just try to highlight here some of the key points. The Werner Report provided a bold description of the final destination, which was an economic and monetary union to be reached in 10 years by 1980. It would include irrevocably fixed exchange rates, preferably, although not necessarily, with the adoption of a common currency, as well as fully liberalized capital movements. The final stage was also meant to include the creation of two new European centers of decision-making to deal with monetary and economic policy respectively. The transfer of powers thus required was surely not an easy story to tell to those faint-hearted listeners. In other words, the Werner Committee made no attempt to hide what EMU would mean in terms of transfer of sovereignty. Member states were duly warned. The Werner Report also provided a detailed description of the first stage, leading to EMU, while essentially leaving open the rest of the transition. The idea, I suppose, was to get member states to agree to the final goal and get the ball rolling, hoping that member states would persevere until they reached the state of Elysian harmony. This is in fact the term used by the then German finance minister, Karl Schiller, to describe the state of a complete EMU. The Werner Committee was pragmatic in its approach, yet the distance between the first stage and the final destination was very big. One step at a time, in the knowledge that one day you may reach the state of Elysian harmony that all involved are supposed to aspire to. This could be one way to read the Werner Report. But what if member governments aren't really committed to getting there? And what if they also have very different expectations about the journey? Using a religious metaphor, if I may, you might think that the Werner Committee had no other choice but following the words of St. Augustine, "God give me virtue, but not yet." But this may be nothing more than the view of a sinner, such as myself. The principle of parallelism proposed by the Werner Group for the transition period was an ingenious attempt to reach a political compromise between economists and monetarists. Interestingly enough, all parties concerned shared at least one thing in common, namely the sincere belief that economic convergence as a precondition for the irrevocable fixity of intra-European exchange rates in the final stage depended on the progressive harmonization of national economic policies, hence ultimately on political will. This is a crucial point to understand. Economies shaped by policies, markets under the control of governments. It was an exaggerated view of the world as it was then and about to explode soon with a big bang. The ammunition for the explosion was to be provided by increasingly mobile international capital and the inherently unstable financial markets. In other words, the Werner Report represented a certain view of the interaction between governments and markets, a view that was widely shared by policymakers at the time, yet a view that could not be sustained for long in a world where market forces were being unleashed and government policies hence became much more constrained. Let me now recap on the main driving forces behind European monetary integration and how the Werner Report tried to handle them back then. The first of the main driving forces was, of course, the search for stability, notably intra-European exchange rate stability as a precondition for the proper functioning of the European market in times of international monetary instability. The large majority among European policymakers, unlike most academic economists, have never been much convinced about the virtues of floating rates. They were even less so at the time of the Werner Report. This strong preference for fixed or at least stable exchange rates, I'm sure, has a lot to do with the European reality of relatively small and very open economies tied together in a common economic and political project. The Werner Report called for a commitment to the final goal of irrevocably fixed intra-European exchange rates. It also provided a detailed description of the first stage and a rough sketch of a federal system of decision-making to underpin irrevocably fixed exchange rates in the final stage of EMU. It did not, however, provide much detail about how to get from the first to the final stage. I should add, to be fair, that the Werner Report also avoided a proper discussion about the implications for the real economy if member governments decided to forego an important instrument of national economic policy, notably the exchange rate, without developing proper substitutes for it. Now let me discuss the second driving force. This was the search for symmetry. Symmetry inside the European regional bloc and symmetry vis-à-vis the rest of the world, notably the United States. The search for internal symmetry has been a key feature of intra-European debate ever since the subject of EMU reached the political agenda. It has taken different forms throughout the long history of European monetary integration. Interestingly enough, the substance has not changed much. The Werner Report adopted the principle of parallelism. It was a good compromise on paper, although the devil is always to be found in implementation, as Europeans were to discover once again, and very soon, during the first stage of EMU. As regards symmetry beyond the borders, Europeans agreed in principle about the goal. However, they could hardly agree about how far they were ready to go in antagonizing the United States in the search for more symmetry inside the Bretton Woods system, and later outside it. The Werner Report called for a common external policy, but stopped short of telling us which direction it should take. Of course, it had never been expected to do so. The third driving force was the search for further integration. In other words, EMU as an end in itself and as the means to achieve closer economic and political integration. Surely not everybody in Europe was on board on this issue either. Gaullists attached to national sovereignty were not to be found only in France at the time. There were in many other countries as well. On this issue, the Werner report was absolutely clear, spelling out what EMU would require in terms of institutions, including revision of the treaty, in order to be viable. And the Werner report certainly did not shy away from establishing a direct link between EMU on the one hand and political union on the other. The final report was submitted in October 1970 and was followed by political decisions taken at the highest level, and not only once. Alas, events took a very different course from what was being decided in Brussels. Thus, in its first incarnation, EMU had a short life. By 1974, the main objectives set by the Werner report were, to all intents and purposes, abandoned. With the benefit of hindsight, it is not very difficult to understand why. Let me elaborate briefly. European Monetary Union had been meant to build on the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates. It thus started with a so-called snake in the tunnel, where the tunnel was to be provided with complements of the US dollar, while the snake would represent a European regional arrangement with reduced intra-EC margins of fluctuation. The snake was meant to be the first concrete step towards the final goal of economic and monetary union. But the dollar tunnel was not destined to last for long. The Nixon administration decided to float the dollar, thus leaving the European snake going up and down in open space. And the European snake got badly hurt in the process. The enlarged community of 9, there were 9 by then, painfully discovered that trying to build a European monetary union in a world of floating exchange rates and faced with unilateral US policies was an altogether different exercise from the one they had signed for on the basis of the Werner report. They were completely unprepared for this radical change of environment. Remember that in 1971, only a few months after the first stage of EMU had started, the US Secretary of Treasury, John Connolly, addressing himself to European finance ministers, referred to the US dollar as our currency but your problem. Europeans were not at all ready for such a world. They were divided, but also their economies diverged. Economic divergence was the internal factor behind the failure of the snake in the tunnel. In other words, it was not just the fault of American benign or unbenign neglect, as American policy was called at the time. European policy coordination did not, and arguably could not, work under the circumstances prevailing at the time. Yet there was another important development going on at the same time, a sign of more things to come. During the first stage of the abortive attempt to build an EMU in the 1970s, we had the first manifestation of German leadership inside the European regional bloc. Monetary integration thus became the unintended vehicle for German leadership. Some people chose to call it reluctant hegemony. All in all, instead of more European unity through EMU, the enlarged community ended up in the 1970s with more divergence and more asymmetry. This is not exactly what the Werner Report had bargained for. Let me now move to the third and final part of my lecture. I would like to invite you to make the time journey back to 2020, to our day. What lessons can we learn from the experience of 50 years since the Werner Report? And I promise to be brief. EMU has gone through more reports. The Delors report and the President's reports, to name but the most important. It has gone through treaty revisions and plenty of crises. For many people, especially those across the Channel and others across the Atlantic, it is indeed remarkable, verging on disbelief, that hundreds of millions of Europeans today have a common currency, the euro. Cassandras never believed it was politically or economically feasible for Europeans to have a common currency, and they have always been only too ready to write it off in times of big crisis. But contrary to all doomsday scenarios, the Maastricht version of EMU has proved to be extremely resilient. Resilient, yes, but has it also been a factor of unity for Europe? This is a fundamental question. And the honest answer, it seems to me, is both yes and no. Let me try to explain. The answer is yes, because EMU remains to this day the single most important act of European integration. More important than the common market, single market, or anything else we have achieved together in our joint effort to build a common European home. Sharing a common currency is not only about monetary policy and macroeconomic policy more generally, and they are surely very important. Money is also about symbols, and it is about sovereignty. Pierre Werner and his fellow members of the committee knew this only too well, and they were ready to spell it out to member governments who, judging from how they behaved, were not ready themselves back then to fully accept the consequences. It could therefore be argued that the Werner Report was ahead of its time. Even so, it did prepare the ground, and it was followed by the European Monetary System, Maastricht, and more. But remember that Europe had to wait for the end of the Cold War and for German unification to find the decisive political catalyst for monetary union. One more proof that money is high politics par excellence. Later came the big financial crisis, and now the pandemic. They both presented existential challenges for European integration. And we've ended up with more integration. The euro is undoubtedly a powerful instrument that binds Europeans together. In times of big crisis, every time they reached the edge of the precipice and looked down at the abyss, they took a big step back. They did so simply because they realized that any attempt to return to national currencies would spell economic and political disaster. It was therefore fear of the alternative, not so much love for each other, let us admit it, that ultimately kept Europeans together in the worst moments of the international financial crisis and now with the pandemic. This is precisely what many non-European observers failed to grasp, while making predictions of an imminent demise of the euro. In this respect, the euro has proved to be a potent unifying factor, and it is likely to remain so in the years to come. Monetary union as a leaven for the development of political union, which in the long run it cannot do without. These are the exact words used in the Werner report. Member governments, beware. The survival of the euro is a clear testimony to Europe's collective instinct of survival, if nothing else. But it has come at a big price in economic, political, and social terms. The price the Eurozone has paid for an incomplete monetary union in times of crisis. In the early years of the 2010s, we had the Great Recession and more economic divergence. European politics turned toxic between and within countries. Recriminations and insults were exchanged in European councils, and the stakes were very high. While protest movements and anti-systemic forces grew in individual countries, systemic failure and populism went hand in hand. Thus, at the peak of the crisis, EMU became a major factor of European disunity, adding to centrifugal forces within and between European countries. This is, mind you, a very different conclusion from the one we reached only a minute ago. And I submit to you, both are equally valid. Thus, the answer to our original fundamental question, namely whether EMU has been a factor of unity for Europe or not, should be both yes and no. And because the stakes are indeed very high, we may not be able to afford many more no's in the future. We've also learned from experience that institutions matter a great deal. The Werner report had duly warned us. When the financial crisis struck, we had very few institutions and policy instruments to deal with it. Maastricht, after all, had been the product of political feasibility and the economic orthodoxy prevailing at the time. Unfortunately, what was politically feasible at Maastricht proved to be totally inadequate when the crisis struck, while economic orthodoxy also suffered a huge blow to its credibility. It was a real mess. Europe was totally unprepared, and this is precisely why the international financial crisis soon morphed into an existential crisis of the euro. It is also why Europe fared worse than the United States, where the crisis had originated from. And in the end, we had to rely on the European Central Bank, a federal institution par excellence, to act as the deus ex machina, the god that intervened from above to save the euro. But this, in turn, raised fundamental questions about legitimacy and the democratic deficit of EMU. You really cannot run a monetary union with just a central bank and some intergovernmental cooperation. I exaggerate deliberately to make the point, but not much. We are still far from having the kind of institutions that Werner and his committee members had envisaged for the final stage of EMU. On the other hand, EMU remains to this day an asymmetrical system. It is asymmetrical both in terms of the relationship between monetary and fiscal policy and in terms of the relationship between surplus and deficit countries. The principle of parallelism between monetary and fiscal policy envisaged in the Werner report has never really worked in practice. We made considerable progress under duress during the euro crisis. And now the pandemic is forcing us to take joint measures on the fiscal side that would have been simply unimaginable only a short time ago. Europe is being forged in crisis, as Jean Monnet had predicted. This may indeed be true, but it is also true that Europe is living dangerously and often reacting too slowly in times when the geopolitical and geoeconomic tectonic plates are shifting fast. A world in transition may not wait for Europe to move in her habitual slow pace. In an unstable international system in which aggressive unilateralism increasingly takes over from multilateral rules, and to be more precise, in a dollar standard which can be used by unscrupulous political leaders to impose foreign policy choices on other countries, the importance of EMU is now stronger than ever. The term in fashion today is strategic autonomy, and it can apply to a wide range of policy areas. In the monetary field, strengthening the international role of the euro, coupled with a united European stance in international fora, starting with the IMF, would contribute a great deal to Europe's strategic autonomy. We have travelled a long way since the Werner report. Drew our attention to the importance of the external dimension of EMU. Yet, despite having a common currency for now more than 20 years, the progress we have made in this respect leaves very much to be desired. And remember, there is another side to asymmetry, namely in the distribution of the burden of adjustment between surplus and deficit countries. This asymmetry has persisted for long within the Eurozone. It first manifested itself with a snake in the tunnel, later with the European monetary system, and then inside EMU after Maastricht. Repeated attempts to play with rules that would ensure some degree of symmetry, always failed. And the problem reached a peak during the euro crisis. Now, in a world of large public deficits and rapidly rising debt, I'm talking about the world today, with central banks printing almost at will, with zero or below zero interest rates, and imploding economies caught in a liquidity trap, more recently also hit by the pandemic, this asymmetry has been temporarily put on the shelf. It no longer bites. How long will this last is really anybody's guess. In the meantime, we are all being forced to re-examine old conventional truths about economics. We surely live in strange times. Let me conclude. We have traveled a long way since the time of the Werner Report. The EU27 is a very different economic and political entity from the ECF6 50 years ago. The report written by Pierre Werner and his committee members is indeed one of the landmarks in this fascinating journey of European integration. We therefore have good reasons to celebrate its 50th anniversary with such an important and inspiring conference. I should like to thank you once again for allowing me to be part of it. And I thank you most of all for your attention. Finish.